At 75, Larry Holmes finally named the two dirtiest boxers he ever faced. Larry Holmes defended the heavyweight championship 20 times. 20. Against the best men his era could produce. Jerry Cooney, Ken Norton, Ernie Shavers, Muhammad Ali. 20 consecutive title defenses across 7 years of the most complete heavyweight championship reign between Ali and Tyson. And when someone finally asked him to name the two dirtiest fighters he ever faced, Holmes did not hesitate. The answers shocked the boxing world. Larry Holmes came from Cuthbert, Georgia, moved to Easton, Pennsylvania as a child, grew up poor enough that the alternative to boxing was the street, and the street in Easton in the 1960s was not where a young man from Georgia wanted to end up permanently. He found the gym, found the jab. Spent years as Muhammad Ali's sparring partner learning the heavyweight championship from the inside, absorbing the education that proximity to greatness provides, without getting paid what that education was worth. He turned professional in 1973, won the WBC heavyweight championship in 1978, and spent the next 3 decades saying exactly what he thought about every man he ever faced. Holmes was never diplomatic. That was not who he was and had never been who he was, not in the gyms of Easton where he developed the jab that trainers still study decades later. Not in the press conferences where he said things about Muhammad Ali and Rocky Marciano that the boxing world was not ready to hear. Not in the interviews where age had reduced neither the directness nor the certainty with which he delivered his assessments of everyone and everything that had touched his career. He had opinions, strong ones, documented ones, on the record ones that journalists could quote and boxing historians could reference, and anyone who wanted to understand what Larry Holmes thought about the sport and the people in it could find without difficulty. And when the question turned to dirty fighters, to the men who had operated at the edges of what professional boxing permitted, who had used tactics that the rules technically prohibited or barely tolerated, who had brought something into the ring beyond their legitimate physical gifts, Holmes had opinions on that too. 2 names sat at the top of the list, not because they were the men who had beaten him most convincingly. His career had produced losses to Michael Spinks twice, to Mike Tyson, to Evander Holyfield, and Holmes had always been honest enough to acknowledge when an opponent had performed at a level he could not match on a given night. These 2 names sat at the top of the dirty list for different reasons. One was dirty in the way that raw elemental violence was dirty, the specific overwhelming force of a puncher whose right hand operated at a level that made the word punch seem inadequate, that accumulated damage in ways that the rules of boxing could not prevent, and the human body was not designed to fully absorb. The other was dirty in the way that deliberate rule-breaking was dirty, the elbows, the headbutts, the punches after the bell tactics that Holmes had watched, experienced personally, and called out publicly with the same directness that had defined every public statement of his career. 2 different kinds of dirty, both real, both documented. Headbutts Ernie Shavers. The first time Larry Holmes fought Ernie Shavers was the 25th of March, 1978. A world title eliminator. Holmes, at 28 years old, undefeated, building the record and the ranking that a title shot required against a man whose nickname was the Black Destroyer, and who had earned it with a knockout percentage that made serious boxing people genuinely uncomfortable when they studied the record. Ernie Shavers had 70 knockouts in 76 wins from 91 professional fights at that point in his career. 92%. Not the knockout percentage of an elite heavyweight who punched hard and occasionally finished fights with a single shot. The knockout percentage of a man whose right hand operated as a different category of weapon from what the word punch typically described. Something that landed and produced consequences that other elite heavyweights' right hands did not produce. Holmes knew what he was walking into. Before the fight, referee Dave Pearl came into Holmes's dressing room for the standard pre-fight instructions, the routine conversation that preceded every professional boxing match. Pearl gave the fighters a chance to ask questions. Holmes asked one. He asked whether he could run, not as a genuine request, as the deadpan acknowledgement of a man who understood what Ernie Shavers' right hand felt like when it landed on a heavyweight's head, and who understood that the most honest response to that knowledge was the one that named the reality directly before the first bell rang. The fight went the distance. Holmes won a unanimous decision. His jab controlled distance round after round, establishing the range that kept Shavers from loading up on the right hand freely, making the most dangerous puncher in the division work for every opportunity to throw his signature weapon. But the right hand landed. More than once, Holmes said afterward, and would say in every interview across the following decades when the question of the hardest puncher he ever faced came up, that Ernie Shavers hit harder than any man he ever shared a ring with. Harder than Mike Tyson. Harder than Jerry Cooney. Harder than any of the formidable punchers that 20 title defenses had introduced him to across 7 years as champion. Ernie Shavers, no doubt about it. He could knock the hell out of you. Not a qualified assessment, not a comparative analysis that weighed multiple factors. A direct statement delivered with the certainty of a man who had first-hand experience of what Ernie Shavers' right hand felt like when it arrived correctly. The second fight, the 28th of September, 1979, confirmed everything the first had suggested. Shavers had earned a rematch by producing the kind of performances in the intervening period that a former title challenger needed to produce to get back into the championship conversation. He arrived in Las Vegas with the same right hand and the same percentage and the same specific physical capacity for producing knockdowns and knockouts against elite opposition. Holmes won again. Unanimous decision. Again. 11 rounds of the most controlled and complete jab-based performance of his championship reign, keeping Shavers at the end of the jab, denying him the range and the angle and the specific positioning that the right hand needed to produce its full effect. But Shavers had Holmes hurt. Round 7. A right hand that arrived in the specific moment where Holmes's guard was not positioned to absorb it cleanly. The MGM grand crowd going silent for a moment. Holmes's legs doing what legs do when a heavyweight right hand lands on a human jaw, with the force that Ernie Shavers generated, communicating the information that the brain was processing to the rest of the body with a delay. That experienced ringside observers recognized immediately. Holmes survived, won the round, won the fight, defended the championship again, and walked out of the MGM Grand with the absolute certainty confirmed across 2 fights and 22 rounds of first-hand experience that what Ernie Shavers' right hand delivered was different in kind, not just in degree from what other heavyweight punchers produced. Not technically dirty. Shavers competed within the rules of professional boxing across both fights without the kind of tactics that Holmes reserved his specific criticism for. But dirty in the specific sense that overwhelming elemental force, the kind that operated at the absolute limit of what a human being could legally deliver to another human being within the framework of professional boxing, was dirty. The kind of dirty that made a man ask a referee before a world title fight whether he could run. And mean it. Has honed Mike Tyson. Holmes called Mike Tyson a dirty fighter publicly. Not in private. Not in conversation with people he trusted. In an interview. On the record. With the specific directness that defined everything Holmes said about anyone he disagreed with across a career of disagreeing with people publicly. It happened after the Tyson-Tyrell Biggs fight in October 1987. Holmes was at the fight. Watched what Tyson did across 7 rounds. Watched the elbows. Watched the headbutts. watched the punches that landed after the referee had called break and both men were supposed to step back and reset, and then walked in front of cameras and said what he saw. "I didn't see a guy with class in there. I see a guy who throws elbows. I see a guy who throws headbutts. And I see a guy who hits after the bell." Not an off-the-cuff comment made in frustration. A deliberate public assessment of a fighter's tactics, delivered by a man who had spent his entire career studying heavyweight boxing from the inside, and who understood the difference between the aggressive physicality that the sport permitted and the specific rule-bending that it technically prohibited. Holmes was already committed to fighting Tyson at that point. The financial negotiations had been going on for months, $3 million on the table. The specific combination of money and competitive pride that had brought a 38-year-old Holmes out of retirement and into the ring against the most feared heavyweight on the planet. He knew what was coming, and said it anyway. The 22nd of January, 1988. Convention Hall, Atlantic City. Holmes had promised to knock Tyson out, had said it publicly multiple times in the weeks before the fight, the specific confidence of a man who had spent 15 years at the top of the heavyweight division and who believed, whatever the odds said about the matchup, that his experience and his jab and his understanding of the heavyweight championship gave him tools that Tyson had not yet encountered in his professional career. 4 rounds. That was what Tyson needed. The speed was the first thing that Holmes encountered, the specific combination of hand speed and foot speed and explosive lateral movement that made Tyson almost impossible to jab effectively, because by the time the jab arrived, target had already moved. The jab that had controlled Ernie Shavers across 22 rounds of 2 championship fights, that had established the distance and the rhythm that every Holmes victory had been built on, could not find the range against. A 21-year-old who moved faster than any heavyweight Holmes had faced. The right hand arrived in round 4. Holmes went down, got up, and the fight was stopped. The first time in Larry Holmes's professional career that any man had knocked him out, stopped him, ended a fight by force rather than by decision. Holmes walked out of Convention Hall carrying 2 things: the $3 million and the confirmation experienced from the inside across 4 rounds of everything he had said publicly after watching Tyson fight Biggs. The elbows were real. The headbutts were real. The punches that landed in the moments between the referee's instruction to break and both men's compliance with that instruction were real. Holmes had not invented them, had not exaggerated them for competitive or promotional purposes, had watched them against Biggs and then felt them against himself and walked away from both experiences with the same assessment. Mike Tyson was dirty, not in every moment of every round. The power was real. Holmes was honest enough to acknowledge that the right hand that put him on the canvas in round 4 was a legitimate punch thrown at the right moment with the full force that Tyson's physical gifts produced. The speed was real. The combination punching was real. The devastating effectiveness of a fighter who had been built from the ground up by Cus D'Amato's system and then refined through 27 consecutive professional victories against genuine opposition was real. But alongside all of it, running through the performance like a thread that experienced observers could see, and that Holmes had felt personally, were the tactics that the rules technically prohibited. Holmes called them out before the fight, experienced them during the fight, and called them out again after the fight, with the same directness and the same certainty. Dirty, the word that Larry Holmes used about Mike Tyson. On the record, in front of cameras, multiple times across multiple years. Not the worst fighter he ever faced, not the most dangerous that was Shavers' specific territory, the elemental, overwhelming force of the right hand that Holmes had named as the hardest punch he ever absorbed, but the dirtiest. The man who brought something into the ring that the rules of professional boxing prohibited and used it consistently enough and effectively enough that it formed a recognizable part of how he competed. Holmes had seen it in Biggs. He had felt it himself in Atlantic City. And he had said the same thing about it both times. Two names, two different kinds of dirty. Ernie Shavers, the force of nature. The right hand that operated at the absolute limit of what professional boxing permitted. The punch that Holmes said hit harder than any man he ever faced, harder than Tyson, harder than Cooney, harder than every formidable puncher that 20 title defenses had introduced him to. Mike Tyson, the deliberate rule breaker. The elbows, the headbutts, the punches after the bell. The tactics that Holmes had identified publicly before they fought, and confirmed publicly after the specific dirty that came not from a physical gift, but from a choice about how to compete. Larry Holmes named both men without hesitation. Because that was who Larry Holmes was. A man who had spent his entire career saying exactly what he thought. About Muhammad Ali. About Rocky Marciano. About Don King. About Michael Spinks. About everyone and everything that touched his career with a directness that made him difficult and uncomfortable, and sometimes infuriating to the people who preferred their boxing wrapped in promotional language and diplomatic courtesy. And about the two dirtiest fighters he ever faced. He named them clearly. Let the record speak for itself. Larry Holmes defended the heavyweight championship 20 times. He faced the best and the worst the division could produce across 3 decades of professional boxing. He beat most of them, lost to some of them, and told the truth about all of them. The two dirtiest fighters he ever faced, named without hesitation. That was Larry Holmes. Stay here, more stories like this are coming.